All right, let's talk about souls today. I'm Brit Hartley. I'm an atheist spiritual director here at No Nonsense Spirituality, and I can tell you the exact moment that I lost faith in a soul. So I was in the grocery store, I was listening to a podcast about split brain studies, and at the time I still believed in God and I still believed in souls, was where I was in my religious deconstruction. So at the time, I wasn't an atheist, I wasn't a materialist, I wasn't just following my bias. My bias was that we have a soul and it's somehow connected to God and it somehow lives on after we die. That was my bias at the time. But I was listening to this podcast on split brain studies, and it just kind of blew this world open for me and challenged me in ways that I hadn't yet been challenged. So in cases of severe epilepsy, where they have to sever the corpus callosum, you essentially get this experience where you have each side of your brain having its own independent conscious experience because it's no longer sharing information. And so each hemisphere has its own sense of self. And so in these experiments, when we are, I'm fascinated by split brain studies, but in these experiments, each hemisphere could be asked, and you can do this with the eye that's connected to that part of the brain, and you do it, like this. And so you can ask, do you like this object or this person or this image? And then one hand connected to one side of the brain would give a thumbs up and the other side would give a thumbs down. And so each part of the person, so one part of the person is saying yes, but the other part of the person is saying no. And so some researchers argue that in extreme split brain cases, there really are two conscious agents that are coexisting, each with their own kind of experiences and goals and decisions, even morals. And so if you ask each side, what job you want to have, one will say accountant and the other will point to race car driver. And there's philosophers that even call this, I'm referring to the work of Thomas Metzinger, who called it two centers of consciousness in one body. And so I couldn't make sense of this at the time. And so the left hemisphere, the other thing that blew my mind was that the left hemisphere, which handles language, will make up stories in real time to explain what the right brain is doing, even when it has no access to that information because, the corpus callosum has been split. So if you show an image to just the right hemisphere via the left visual field, and the person may draw or react appropriately, but when you ask why they did it, the left hemisphere will just make up a reason that sounds plausible. So an example would be if you tell the right hemisphere to drink the juice at the table and you ask the left hemisphere that doesn't know that you told them to do that, and you ask the left hemisphere, why did you just drink that juice? Without skipping a beat, you will say, oh, I love orange juice in the morning and I was thirsty, not knowing that you were actually just told to, through the other side of your brain. And so the one that really challenged me, though, is I'm listening to this and I'm trying to process this, that there's two independent brains having an independent conscious experience that are in some ways different people. The one that really challenged my faith at the time was you can ask each side, do you believe in God? And one side believed in God and one didn't. And something clicked for me in that moment where if my brain could be severed into two independent experiences, even with two different sets of beliefs, or you could change something in my brain, like a brain tumor, and then you change my personality, how then could I have a soul that is in any way me? And also, how could you judge that soul? Because if one side of me believes in God and has certain morals and the other side doesn't, does that mean one of my soul, if I had split brain, does that mean one side of me would go to heaven and the other side could go to hell? It just was blowing my mind. I remember the exact moment when I'm in the grocery store, thinking about this, and then I'm gonna flesh this out a little bit. So this idea that we have a stable, consistent personality, or that our soul is our essence, is an idea that's deeply embedded in our culture. But neuroscience is telling us a much more complicated and honestly more fascinating story. So now we have to obviously bring up in 1848 when Gage what was his first name? Is it Thomas Gage? I can't even remember. Gage, the guy that got the railroad spike through his skull that destroyed much of his frontal lobe. And before the accident, he was responsible. He's hardworking. He's kind. Afterward, he becomes impulsive and aggressive and socially inappropriate. His friends say that's no longer Gage. Like, that's no longer my friend. And it's the first documented case showing that changes to the brain can actually change the core of who you are, which, by the way, if you believe in God and something can happen to your brain that changes your personality so that you go to heaven or hell, that is a bullshit system. Like, you could get a railroad spike in your brain and become an asshole and be deserving of hell, or you could get frontal lobe epilepsy, which gives you all kinds of like heavenly visions and makes you feel really close to God, makes you really believe in the supernatural. And you can, God can just change that in your brain, and that will influence where your soul goes after you die. Like, it just didn't make sense to me at the time. But it gets more complicated than that, because obviously my views were somewhat naive because I'm coming from religion, and there's other ways that we can think about the soul that we're going to get into. So stay with me. There's tons of changes that can happen where the core of who you are will change when the brain changes. So the one that I just mentioned, temporal lobe epilepsy, this leads to hyper-religiosity, heightened emotion, spiritual experiences, intense visions and feelings of oneness and the universe during seizures. If you take antidepressants or anti-anxiety meds, or even psychedelics, can reshape how a person experiences themselves. Some report feeling more like themselves again, or some feel like a stranger in their own skin. You can change your hormones. You can change the construct of your brain with medication or psychedelics that can essentially make you a different person. And women go through this throughout our lives with our hormone changes. If you are a woman who experiences a period, or you are married or partnered with someone who experiences a period, you'll know that there may be different people that show up based on hormone changes that are going on in our bodies. There's also damage to the frontal lobe that can cause shifts in personality, things like increased impulsivity, lack of empathy, disregard for social norms, childlike or inappropriate behavior. These people don't realize that they've changed, even though their loved ones feel like they've become strangers. But stay with me, because the most fascinating story I've ever heard on the brain and complications for what it means for a soul is the Hogan twins. If you have not been down this rabbit hole, buckle up, because I fucking love this rabbit hole. It is one of my favorite rabbit holes, especially in the past few years. So Krista and Tatiana Hogan, they're Canadian joined twins. They were born in 2006, and they are a specific kind of conjoined twins where they are joined at the head. But what makes them truly extraordinary is that they don't just share skull space, they share parts of their brain, and they are connected at the thalamus. And so they actually have a thalamus bridge, which most of us don't have. And so the thalamus is a deep brain structure. It acts like a relay station for sensory and motory signals. Motory? I just made that word up. Motor signals. The thalamus is crucial for just like touch, sight, hearing, pain, emotion, conscious awareness. And this isn't just a passive connection. They have a direct neurological link between their brains. So it's not just two people fused together. It's two consciousnesses that are essentially wired into each other. They share a thalamic bridge, which is this and they're the only ones who have it, this physical bundle of neurons that connect their thalamus and relay all of the sensory input to the other twin, which means they are neurologically cross-wired, and they are the only known humans with this kind of direct brain-to-brain link. It's fascinating. I could listen to people talk about them all day, or them. I think there's a documentary on them that you can watch too. But they have shared sensory experience. So if you touch one twin, the other can feel it, but they can't feel it in the way like that you touched them, but they are getting the sensory information that they have been touched, even though you touched the other twin. If you feed one a lemon, the other might react to the sourness even without tasting it herself. It's not just empathy. This is actual literal cross-sensory perception. There's also evidence that Krista and Tatiana can see through each other's eyes. So if one twin's eyes are totally covered, she might be able to describe what the other is looking at, but not because her eyes are seeing anything, but because she's getting the sensory information into her brain. They can also communicate without words. They seem to be able to read each other's thoughts. I wouldn't say it's like that. It's more so that they can respond to each other before anything is said. And so some neurologists believe that their brain connection allows for a kind of pre-verbal or subconscious communication, because you can get information as they're trying to talk, and the other twin can kind of like finish what the twin was going to say based on the sensory input that they're getting of that person's kind of emotion. It's fascinating. But they are different personalities. This is not the same person. Despite their shared neurology, Krista and Tatiana are distinct individuals. They have their own likes, they have their own dislikes, they have their own personalities. One is more introverted, one is more extroverted. They're deeply fused, though, emotionally, neurologically, experientially. If one stubs her toe, the other might wince. If one eats chocolate, the other may smile at the taste. So we literally don't know what will happen when one of these twins dies. There is concern that the surviving twin might not last long either, not just because of grief, but because of the interdependence of their systems. If neural activity is vital to both brains functioning normally, then the collapse of one system could destabilize the other. But it's possible that and so if they're too interdependent to live without the other, it's possible that one twin could experience death of the other twin and might actually experience death briefly before also dying, which blows my mind to think about. It's also possible that one could live independently and survive the other twin, which might not even just feel like grief. Losing a twin is requires a huge grieving process, but it also could feel like part of their own mind has gone dark, given that they share vision, they share sensation, they share emotion, they share even thought. It might not feel like losing a twin. It might really feel like you're losing half of yourself, which would be a very unique kind of bereavement. It'd be a kind of neurological amputation of the self. So philosophers have been discussing these guys since they were only born in 2006, and we only really kind of knew what was going on with them, especially in the past 5 years. And philosophers are arguing that these twins represent a new category of consciousness. They're not really one person, but they're not really two either. And so it challenges our Western ideas that we are an individual. This is the definition of personhood, and I have a soul, and my soul is kind of my essence. It's challenging a lot of these ideas, especially in the West, that we've had around these words and definitions for these words. So for me, if you believe in a soul, are they one soul or are they two? And now, if you say that they are two souls because they're two independent people that share an information bridge, if that's what you say about them, then you also have to admit that I am two souls, because I am also in some ways two brains that share an information bridge. Now, if you say that they are one soul, if you say that I'm one soul, then they also have one soul. But how could they? Because they are entirely different people. One of the girls is extroverted, one of the girls is introverted. They are two people. So how could they then be one soul? So all of this together, the fact that the essence of your personality changes when your brain changes, the idea that the concept of a self is an illusion in and of itself, and that if you sever the brain or you get twins like the Hogan twins, all of that makes me skeptical that there's a soul of Brittany, right? Like of me, because all of this is better explained at the level of the brain. Now, this is where I start to get poetry from people. People will say your soul isn't connected to your brain. Why are we even talking about the brain? But if it's not connected to your brain, then in no way is it you, which means even if you have some kind of life force that lives on after death, if it's not in any way related to your brain, then it's not you. And whatever it is that lives on, you're still dead, because you is an illusion. It's an illusion created in your brain. It's not a solid thing. It's a shortcut that your brain creates out of the complexity of your own psyche. And when your brain dies, the you also then dies. And so let's go through some other ways that people conceptualize the soul. So some people say it's just your life force. And what they'll say then, I've had these conversations so many times, I know what people are going to say here. They're going to say energy cannot be created or destroyed. So therefore, science says I can't be created or destroyed, so I live on. But life is explained through cellular activity, metabolism, homeostasis. There's no missing ingredient called soul that's required for life. And death is gradual. It's not instant. There is no single moment that the soul leaves the body. Rather, these are systems that are failing at different rates. And so this undermines the idea that there's this distinct animating force that is departing when you die. And people who use the energy idea, that the energy of your body must live on in some way because energy can't be created or destroyed. Yeah, the energy of my body goes into the ground, which then becomes a tree. But the tree isn't you. The you is still dead. So I don't really think you can call that something like reincarnation, because if the elements that create me can go into creating other things, then it's more like we're all taking turns with the experience of being. And because other things have died, then I'm able to experience being, and then it will be my turn to die. And then other things can experience being with the elements that used to be part of me. But I'm still dead. Like, I'm not there for any of that. I wasn't there before me, and I wasn't there after me. So I don't really think you can call that something like reincarnation. So some say then that the soul is the part of us that knows right from wrong, or yearns to worship the divine, or has that yearning for the divine. It's what connects us to something higher. This is another argument. But this one is really easy to break down because morality varies widely across time and cultures, and it's more shaped by your upbringing and your society and your experience. It's not a universal inner spark. And also, non-human animals show compassion and grief and cooperation and moral behavior, and they're doing all of that without souls. And so some people are born with some people are born without normal moral intuitions due to brain abnormalities. So then would they be an evil soul, and then we punish them for being born that way because they're not born with moral intuitions? That just seems absurd to me from a supernatural level, whereas it makes sense at the biological level that this person was born without moral intuitions, and maybe it's not even that person's fault. And just like if we were animals, which we are, you can remove people from society. Rats do this all the time. If you don't lose at least 10% of the time when you're wrestling with other rats, then you'll be considered a bully, and they'll just like socially isolate you from society. And we essentially do the same things with humans, that these are the rules of the playground. You have to at least act as if you have empathy, even if you don't, in order to play with the rest of us, and you don't. We need some space from you in society. And animals do the same thing, and they're doing all of that without gods and souls and commandments and all of that. So that just makes more sense to me. So there's this kind of Occam's razor that if we can explain this at the level of the brain, then we actually have no reason to jump into the supernatural. But the best explanation for the soul, I think, is that it's just your inner subjective experience. The soul is what it feels like to be you. It's what's called the ghost in the machine, the qualia, the fact that there's a quality to experience at all, which kind of goes into consciousness and the nature of consciousness. That, I think, right now is the best explanation for soul currently. But when you're under psychedelics or when you're in deep meditation, the sense of the self can dissolve, which suggests that this soul may be just a mental construct, not really an entity. And so while subjective experience is real, it doesn't require a thing called a soul, which may be more of an emergent process of the brain. It's not really an object. So there's been psychedelic trips that I've had, but also deep meditation states where the idea that I'm a Brittany like is so foreign. Like, I'm so far from the idea that like I'm this human named Brittany. Is it like I have no anchor for that thought in some of those spaces? Like, you can go to spaces in psychedelics and meditation where that sense of self can totally dissolve. And so when you get there, you're just sitting in consciousness with objects appearing in consciousness. And we can still explain that at the level of the brain. We don't really need a soul to experience that. And this is where I turn to people like, Sapolsky, where you start talking about free will being an illusion. So in his, groundbreaking 2023 book, Determined, Sapolsky argues that free will is an illusion, and that has major implications for the soul. If everything that you do, if we can add it up, and it's the result of genetics and brain chemistry and early childhood and circumstance, where's the independent choice-making soul? If we can actually explain everything at the level of your brain. So the soul is often seen as this kind of seat of moral responsibility, but Sapolsky's work really blows that up, that it challenges the very possibility of even moral accountability. So his quote is that you're nothing more or less than the sum of your biology and your environment and your history. And so in his work, Behave, Sapolsky breaks down every human behavior from acts of kindness to murder by examining what's happening in the brain seconds, minutes, years, generations before that action. And so he shows that your emotions and your desires and your beliefs and your moral impulses can be traced to neural networks and hormones. And there's no need to invoke a mysterious soul to explain things like compassion or guilt or love. They all have valid neurobiological explanations. And so Sapolsky challenges the idea of good souls or bad souls by showing how the worst human behavior can arise from things like brain tumors and childhood trauma and genetic predispositions. And so if you take away blame and also credit, what is the soul essentially doing? We don't have anything for it to do after we kind of explain it all at the level of the brain. And then he goes on to say why we even believe in souls in the first place, which we have a naturalistic explanation for. Sapolsky is fascinated by, like me, he's fascinated why people believe in souls and gods. And in his lecture, he notes that our brains are these pattern-seeking. We're not really accurate in the way that we see patterns. We oversee patterns usually. We are agency detecting, and we are fear averse. And so this makes a perfect storm for inventing the supernatural. And we are born that way. We are born with a tendency towards the superstitious, just as our nature. And it's a supernatural. The soul becomes this supernatural explanation for the complexity of our experience in our brains. Why do I sometimes think thoughts that are quote unquote good and some of my thoughts are quote unquote bad? Why do I dream? Why do I have this sense of self and I fear death and I have this desire to continue on? So because of all these evolutionary reasons for why we believe that we have this strong sense of there's evolutionary reasons for why we believe that we have a soul, because we have a brain that has a fear of death, that has a strong sense of identity. We have a brain that we fully don't understand, a very complex psyche that we can't see all of what it's doing. And we're born with this tendency towards the superstitious. It's the perfect combination for a soul belief. And so this is where people will start to get even more poetic in ways that are become increasingly absurd to me. So people will say your soul is just a drop of water and then it returns to the ocean. That's one I hear. Or the other one is your soul is like a radio signal. And just because the radio is broken, like with dementia, the radio being your brain, doesn't mean that the radio signal is gone. It just means that the radio is a little broken. And like, I get that some things are best explained by poetry. Like, I really do get that. If I wanted to explain what it feels like to be madly in love, I may use poetic language. But the thing is, we can also explain evolutionarily why we develop feelings like love. And I can tie that poetry, I can anchor that poetry to hormones and chemicals in the brain. But this soul poetry of how it's not connected to your brain at all, and yet it's still somehow you, that makes no sense to me. There's no anchor for that. We have no way to anchor that to reality. And if it's not you, if it's just a life force that goes back into the ocean and becomes another thing, well, that's also not you. So you still died. Like, you're dead. No matter what kind of ocean poetry is continuing on. And so then I can hear this argument in my head, because again, I have this discussion with so many people. What about near-death experiences? That's the next thing in the conversation. Well, what about what's going on with the near-death experiences? For me, all that they are proving, and I have done deep dives into this, all they are proving is that there's a subjective experience to dying. I could move you into a guided meditation right now where you would feel like you've left your body. It does not necessarily mean that you left your body. I could also give you so much DMT that you go into another universe. That could all still be happening at the level of the brain. Out of body experiences, OBEs, which is a hallmark of many NDEs, can also be triggered by specific brain mechanisms. Studies have shown that if you get a disruption in the parietal lobe, which is the part of the brain that's responsible for spatial awareness and self-awareness, that people will experience a disembodiment, feeling as if they are outside their physical body. So we can get you there through guided meditation, certain psychedelics, or even just things like trauma to the brain or time of death, when someone's dying, things like that, can mess up essentially the part of the brain that is responsible for spatial awareness. Well, then people will say, what about the people who experience light and visions? And there's some similarities. Why are people having this similar experience? But research has found that people who have strong religious or spiritual beliefs will tend to report visions of a heaven or a deity. But if you have a more secular outlook, then you will be more likely to report just experiences of light or a peaceful void. And so the idea that, whatever we're bringing to this experience will shape our near-death state. And so there's further, which is further supporting the theory that the brain is interpreting and generating these experiences based on your pre-existing beliefs or the pre-existing beliefs of the society that you're in. So some researchers also propose that the body is releasing endogenous DMT at the time of death. And DMT is very associated with things like vivid, dreamlike states, visual experiences, a feeling of transcendence. All of this is common with NDEs. And then hypoxia, where you're just not getting enough oxygen into the brain, can also induce this. So is it really a soul having an experience if you're going to get the same experience with DMT or similar experiences with temporal lobe epilepsy? And also, like, the people who champion NDEs as science, if you really look at the studies, they're often tossing out any evidence that doesn't fit the narrative. Like people who have a lot of anxiety, they'll just kind of throw that out because it doesn't fit the story of what they're wanting. And then people will say, well, what about this person? And they couldn't have known. That's the argument. They couldn't have known. They left their body. They couldn't have known that the doctor had mustard on their tie because, their eyes were closed and they were working on them. Like, what do you mean they couldn't have known? Like, I just don't like that argument. Your brain is taking in 11 million bits of information per second. You can pay attention to 20 bits of information per second. That's over a lifetime. There are people who remember every word that they've ever read. There's a guy who flew over Rome once and drew the whole thing perfectly. There are people who know all the numbers of pi. Like, the brain is incredibly good at taking in and storing information, even if you don't consciously notice it. If you walk into a room and you have a gut feeling about something being off, your brain may have noticed something in the environment subconsciously, and a detail that you weren't aware of, and that triggered that feeling. And so sometimes, like, the part of the brain that feels like a you is like the last person in your brain to like know what's going on, because so much is going on in your subconscious. I had this actually happen to me the other day. I was flipping through the channels at a hotel, and it was some rom-com, and it was Jennifer Lopez, and she was dancing with someone. And I had this gut feeling that, like, she's dancing with a bad guy. Like, why is everyone smiling? Like, something felt off in my body. Like, she's dancing and they're all smiling, but my gut was like, ew, gross. And I was like, what is going on? And when I was watching it, I realized it was because it was Ralph Fiennes, I think is how you say his name, who plays Lord Voldemort. And my subconscious knew she's dancing with Lord Voldemort. Like, what are you doing? But my brain, the part of me that like feels like a me, the you part of me, hadn't yet caught up. And so I'm watching this rom-com, having this gut feeling, because the rest of my brain was like, that's Lord Voldemort, run away, little girl. Anyway, but stuff like that happens all the time. So, and even if our life is flashing before our eyes, our brains do this when it is under duress. It's looking for information that's helpful. And so it feels like your life is flying by. Really consider this. This is something that I think people don't appreciate how strong of an argument this is against the soul. This is all similar to third man syndrome. So third man syndrome is when people in extreme or life-threatening situations feel like there's an unseen third person with them that offers guidance or comfort or support or says like, you need to stand up right now and walk this way. And this is a phenomenon that happens to mountaineers and explorers and even survivors of disasters. And the strange part is that we know that the third person wasn't physically there, but the person feels a real sense of their presence. So what the brain is doing is that the brain is processing a ton of information all the time subconsciously. And in moments of intense stress or anger, the brain can go into overdrive and pick up on cues that we're not consciously aware of, and then project this third person figure. It's not supernatural. The brain is trying to find a way to survive. And so it projects some wise hiker who's going to say, you need to stand up right now, or you're going to die from lack of oxygen or whatever it is. And you need to walk this way. And we know that that person wasn't there. So the brain can draw on stored memories, emotions, internalized models, and project this mental figure, and it feels like it's right there with us. So even though it feels like someone is physically present, it's the brain's way of trying to survive through extreme fear and uncertainty. And there are similarities in these stories. So if you believe in every NDE story, you also have to believe that every hiker also experienced a third person and also actually talked to that third person, and that is also real. When we know for sure that a person wasn't there and we know how and why the brain is doing this. And so for me, the fact that you are experiencing something at the time of death and no one actually really dies and comes back, and what you see has a lot to do with your pre-existing beliefs, and your brain is capable of projecting things at the time of death, even similar experiences like third man syndrome. To me, all of this can be explained at the level of the brain. And we have to remember the direction that these things go in history. Every single time in the past where we've had a supernatural explanation for something, we eventually find a naturalistic explanation for it. And that line only goes in one direction. There is nothing on record where we used to have a scientific explanation, but now a supernatural explanation is now better. Now, that doesn't mean that we can know for sure that materialism and naturalism can explain everything. We can't be that bold yet. But considering how superstitious we are, how many gods lie in the ash heap of history that people believed in, how our explanations have always been wrong, we should use an incredible amount of caution before jumping into the supernatural, because the chances that every other human is wrong, but you watched the correct combination of YouTube videos and had the correct experiences in meditation, that you have the truth about the soul and everyone else is wrong, like statistically, even if that person existed, it's not you. Like, it's probably not you. And then this is where, again, like, I'm having this conversation so many times, I can tell what you're going to say. This is where people bring in, well, what about quantum physics? And I told you I've had this conversation so many times, and it's not because I'm trying to convince people that they don't have a soul. I don't want to be right about this. I want there to be a soul. I engage in these conversations so someone can show me where I'm wrong. Like, to this day, I mourn the apparent reality that someday my child will want to talk to me and will say, I want to call mom, and I won't be there. Like, I don't want that. That's not what I would have chosen. I certainly don't have an identity trying to protect that belief. In fact, I lost my identity and community when I lost belief in God and the soul. So I want to be wrong here, but quantum physics is not going to be the answer. Quantum physics is pretty wild at the tiny scale of atoms and particles, with things like particles being in multiple states at once or mysteriously connected over long distances. And so because of this, some people think that quantum physics might be where we can explain things like consciousness and near-death experiences, or even the idea of the soul. Like we're hiding a lot of magic that we want to be true in quantum spookiness. But quantum effects are really delicate and really only show up at the tiny world of atoms and subatomic particles. The brain, however, is made of billions of neurons, and these are on a much larger scale where quantum effects don't play a role. Quantum particles also need very cold and isolated conditions in order to behave in these strange ways. But the brain is warm and wet, and we can see and study neurons, and it's constantly interacting with its surroundings. So the weirdness of quantum physics doesn't really apply here. The brain works with just good old-fashioned classic biology, and quantum spookiness doesn't scale up to the level of neurons in the brain. It just doesn't scale like that. So then let's move to the whatabouts. What about the story who thought about her mom, and in that exact moment, she found out that that's the moment her mom died? There are mysterious stories like that all around us. I'm a spiritual director. I hear them all the time. I have 20 years of listening to these experiences. I ask chaplains, what's your wildest story? And they have some wild stories. I talk to death doulas. Tell me your wildest stories. I'm always listening to these stories. And let's say most of them, like at least a lot of them, you can explain with naturalistic explanations and cognitive biases. Like hindsight bias is usually the one at play here. Like people will think of their mom 100 times, but forget that they did unless it fits into a meaningful pattern, like your mom dying in that moment. Our brains are meaning-making, pattern-making machines. They are doing that work without you, which is why it's a bias. You don't know that you're doing this. So let's say we clear everything off the table that can be explained by the brain and cognitive biases, which honestly I think is most of these stories. What do you do with the ones that you really can't explain? And there are some things I can't quite explain, at least not confidently. Stories from people I trust have told me things that I've seen guiding people on psychedelics, things in my own life. What do we do with the things that we really can't explain how you knew something? Now, before you all accuse me of being religious about materialism and knowing for sure that nothing happens after we die, which would be a really strong stance to make, just know I'm not making that stance. There is a huge difference between I know nothing happens after we die and I'm not convinced of a soul yet. I don't see enough evidence for that. So for me, in the space, that's the space of what I hope is intellectual humility, that there are times when I can't explain things. And when that happens, I say, that's mysterious. That's interesting. I don't create a story about it because in all likelihood, my story about that thing is going to be wrong. At the very least, what we can say is that we are more aware and are more interconnected than we currently have the science to understand, meaning our psyche is doing more than we realized in the background, and we are more connected to each other than we currently fully understand. That's all we can say. But that doesn't give us reason in the gap of that knowledge to say, because I can't explain this thing that happened, therefore there is a soul, and souls had past lives and souls have future lives, and the whole story of it. That's where we lose the plot. Every time we use our subjective experience to tell a story about objective reality, we look back in history, we have always been wrong. We are always bad at that game. So my current stance is I'm not convinced we have a soul. It would be lovely. I want to be wrong about this. But when things happen that I can't explain, the best way to stay open-minded about what's actually going on with ultimate reality is to say, that's mysterious. I'm going to think on that more. I'm going to explore all the possible explanations rather than say, oh, I can't explain it, therefore insert story that I want to be true. Insert story about ultimate reality. That's the move that we as humans have to stop doing because we're just always wrong. And we cannot ever say that our subjective experience tells us anything about objective reality. Otherwise, the Mormon who just felt like the Book of Mormon is historical is right too. And Thor is real, and Zeus is real, and the lady that saw aliens is real, and all the alien stories are real, and every religion is true, and Lori Daybell really is talking to Jesus. Like, if we're going to say that subjective experience equals objective reality, you have to allow tens of thousands of years of everyone else's supernatural claims too. You have to allow that on the table. So if you pushed me to like lay my chips on the table a little bit here, I would say my best guess is it's hard to believe that a computer can give you an emotional response. You can watch a video on a computer, talk to your grandma, have ChatGPT be your therapist, listen to a story, do all things on your computer that can bring you to absolute tears. I've had moments where with ChatGPT where I had an emotional response. I've watched movies on this very computer where my life was forever changed. And yet this computer really can be explained by zeros and ones. It really can be explained even though there's an experience that I'm having with that computer. I would guess that it's something like that, but I can't know for sure. So until there's more information, I say I'm not yet convinced that we have a soul, but by being skeptical and not jumping onto the first story that my brain clings to in order to cheat death and hold on to my identity, hopefully in my lifetime we can make some more headway on this question of consciousness and life after death and soul and all these things. In the meantime, not believing in a soul for me has yielded some good results. At first, it felt like dying, like my identity dying when you realize that your sense of self is an illusion and that you're going to die. But then come the benefits: freedom, the ability to change my mind because my identity isn't wrapped around anything being true, focusing on this life and how I want to experience it, telling my people I love them in this life because I don't know if I'm going to be able to come back as a butterfly and land on someone's shoulder. So I tell them in this life. And now I'm at peace with it because I'm not clinging to have to exist forever. The elements that made me used to be parts of all kinds of things: a dinosaur, a tree, an animal. Right now, it's my turn to get to experience existence. And then when my turn is over, I don't feel that clinging anymore, that I need to live on. I need to cheat death. My identity needs to live on. I've so accepted impermanence that essentially I just live with so much more gratitude and so much more freedom of identity, where I'm able to change. And also just realizing, just like with anything, you take your turn and now it's my turn, and then my turn will end and it's something else's turn. And I just feel at peace with all of that. So the most poetic that I will get with this soul reincarnation stuff is perhaps one day, you who made it to the end of this video, whoever you are, maybe one day a cell that used to be me will become part of a tree, and a cell that used to be you will become a bird, and you'll rest for a moment on the branches, and we will meet each other again in that moment, and you'll sing a song, and it won't quite be me and it won't quite be you, but we'll meet again in another way for a moment, and you'll rest on that tree, and we'll be together again in some strange way. That's as poetic as I can go for now. But I'd love to know in the comments, if you believe in the soul, what do you mean by that? Where did I go wrong? Interesting stories that influence you. I love a good story. And like I said, I want to be wrong about this. Like, even though I have a lot of benefits for letting go and accepting impermanence as a mother, it's never like, I'm never okay with the idea that my child will reach out to me and I won't be there one day. Like, I'm happy to be wrong about this one. And if you're someone who listened to this and it increased your death anxiety because your soul beliefs are masking your death anxiety, and you're in need of tools and resources for that, as always, check out my Death and Mortality course, where I go over all the resources I use with clients to be able to build resilience and peace with the idea of death and dying. And then let me know what you want me to cover next week as we explore spirituality, but keep our wits about us at the same time, because something that I do say that I really love to do is soul work. And sometimes I do use that word because there's not a great secular word for that. But what I mean by that is that we can do shadow work and inner child work and psychedelics and parts work and guided meditations and study mythology and do dream work, which I've really been loving lately, and symbolism and core values work and storytelling and paying attention to your resonances. We can do all of that without knowing for sure that our supernatural story is true. And by the way, with my clients, I don't talk about beliefs at all. We just do that work in whatever framework you come in, because it's spiritual abuse in a coaching setting for me to put my beliefs on others. But the reason people trust me in this setting is because they know that I'll hold space for mystery and wonder and awe in the stories they have. But I won't try to do things like say, oh, that's the Holy Ghost talking to you. I just hold space for it and find ways to do soul work in as healthy of a way as possible without putting a story over it that I'm forcing you to believe in. So I would never give a rant like I just gave in a coaching setting. It'd be super inappropriate. But I also want to be transparent in what I believe in so people can make informed choices about the people that they listen to. I don't like this trick that pastors do where they talk to their congregation one way, but in like private or academic settings, their real beliefs are totally different. I don't want to do that. That's not my vibe. So see you next week, and we will continue on doing some non-soul work. That's it for me. Bye.